Welcome back. I am attorney Nicholas Hicks, and today we are going to begin the discussion concerning divorce. And before we begin, I must tell you that the information I am giving you is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be legal advice. You should contact a New York attorney to consult with them to determine how the law might apply to your particular circumstances. Now, divorce. Obviously, very unpleasant topic, something that no one wants to have to deal with. We get married and we hope that it lasts forever, but sometimes, for whatever reasons, it can't. Now, to begin with, and we're going to be going into quite a few things with respect to divorce. To begin with, it is very important to understand that in the state of New York, marriage is a property right. And unless a divorce action has begun or a separation action is taking place, or there is a legal separation by way of a separation agreement that's been filed, I have seen the look of horror on many clients' faces when they find out that although they've been physically separated for 10, 20, 30 years, that during this period of time, they have, along with their spouse, been accumulating what we call a marital estate. I had a gentleman come in some years ago who had retired from one of the local auto plants, a very sizable pension, just decided that he wanted to cut loose ends and he wanted to get a divorce. He told me that he had been separated from his wife about a year after, physically separated from his wife about a year after their marriage. They both had moved on with their lives some 30 years ago. And I had to tell this gentleman that the pension that he accumulated over those 30 years, the home that he had paid off in the 30 years, the automobiles, the stocks, all these assets that he accumulated over the 30 years that his wife had made no contribution to, was nevertheless considered marital property, and that his wife could make a claim to that property. And frankly, I thought he was going to fall out the chair when I told him that, because he assumed that since he was physically separated and that his wife had not contributed a penny to any of these things, that she would not be able to make any kind of legal claim to these things. But nothing could be further from the truth. Why do I bother to tell you that? Because you should not leave those loose ends when it comes to things as serious as marriage and divorce. If you know that you no longer want to be married, you should take the necessary steps to dissolve the marriage, if for no other reason, so that you and your spouse's assets and liabilities work the same way. We're going to talk about that. Do not become entangled, and that you get a different result than what it is you intend. So if you're no longer in the marriage that you want to be in, you should take the necessary steps to dissolve that marriage, because you may end up like that gentleman to find out that years and years later your spouse is now making a claim against assets that you worked hard for that they had no hand in. Okay, so divorce. The first question is, who can get divorced in the state of New York? And what we mean, what lawyers call that, is refer to that as jurisdiction, which is to say, what people can the state of New York actually divorce, who they have jurisdiction over? Well, in order to get a divorce in the state of New York, you first have to establish this jurisdiction. And that happens one of two ways. Either you were married in the state of New York and the plaintiff now has resided in that state, in the state of New York, continuously for at least 1 year or more prior to beginning the divorce action. So you're married in New York, you've lived in New York for at least a year before you commence a divorce action. If you meet those two requirements, married in the state, have resided for a year continuously prior to the action of the divorce, New York has jurisdiction and you can commence a divorce action, assuming that you meet other qualifications, which we're going to talk about. The other way that New York State has jurisdiction over parties is if you were not married in the state of New York, however, you have resided in the state of New York continuously for 2 years or more prior to the commencement of the action. So you were married in Las Vegas, but you've lived in New York State for 2 years or more, and you want to commence a divorce action in this state, New York would have jurisdiction over it because you meet those requirements. All right. Now, assuming that New York has jurisdiction and that you can in fact commence a divorce in this state, the next issue is, do you have one or more grounds for divorce in New York State? Now, New York State recognizes 7 grounds for the divorce, for a divorce action. You only need to meet one ground in order to qualify for a divorce. The newest ground, which I think most of us kind of relieved, is known as an irretrievable breakdown of marriage, which has lasted for at least 6 months prior to the commencement of the action. So what's an irretrievable breakdown? Can be anything. You know, we don't see eye to eye, we argue all the time, we don't get along. Excuse me. We don't get along, we don't like each other anymore. Whatever it is. If that's continued for a period of 6 months more, then you have a ground. Now, the other grounds are these: adultery, abandonment, which is that the defendant has left without your permission and has been gone continuously for a year or more. If the defendant is incarcerated after the marriage for a period of 3 years or more than 3 years. If there is cruel and inhuman treatment, which used to be probably the most popular ground. Cruel and inhuman treatment doesn't take as much proof as the name sounds. A lot of things can constitute cruel and inhuman treatment depending on what's going on and how long it's been going on. If you've been separated for a year or more in accordance with a court-ordered separation or a separation agreement. So those are the 7 grounds for divorce. You only need to meet one of those grounds in order to qualify for a divorce. Now, you should also know it's a practical matter. A lot of people will say, well, I will fight you. I'm not going to let you get a divorce. Truth is, New York doesn't make people stay married. And if a plaintiff wants a divorce, they're going to get one. Especially with the newest ground now, the irretrievable breakdown of marriage. Just the fact that you've got 2 spouses arguing in court about whether or not the marriage should stay in place. One person wants to leave, the other person doesn't want the person to leave. That's an irretrievable breakdown. You've got 2 spouses who can't agree about whether to stay together, which is, the core issue. So that in and of itself would probably qualify. So again, you have to sort of come to the realization, if you're on the other side of this, that if a spouse wants a divorce in New York State, they will get one. It's just a question of whether it's going to be a miserable process or something that's going to be worked out amicably. Okay. Now, we touched on it a little bit earlier when we were talking about how property is accumulated in a marriage and how debt is accumulated in the marriage. And we're going to talk more about that when we come back. What do we do with the things that we've accumulated, the assets? what are assets, what's mine, what's theirs, what's shared, what's not, what's excluded from marital property, how does debt work, who pays what in a divorce, what debt belongs to whom, how do we divvy that up. We're going to talk about all those things when we come back. So stay tuned to the second part of divorce. Join me again, attorney Nicholas Hicks. Thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon.